Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good lunch. I'll wait for some others to file in. I see some in the foyer coming in as well. So we'll start the afternoon session. Thank you for cooperating with the adjustments to the agenda. The next session, starting here at 1:15, end at 1:55, is Can the United States Facilitate an International Arctic Seaway? This panel is moderated by Mead Treadwell, the former Lieutenant Governor of the state of Alaska, former chair of the United States Arctic Research Commission, and current co-chair of the Polar Institute's Advisory Board. Mead?
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask the panel to take their seats, and I just would like to start with a short presentation, if they can cue up slides. The title of this panel today is Can the United States Facilitate an International Arctic Seaway? And the concept is really this. I had the honor of being chair before Fran Ulmer of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. We had a deputy director named Lawson Brigham, who you've heard at this conference, who seemed to collect more air miles than probably the rest of us combined. In setting up, bringing the 8 Arctic nations together for the first time with the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment. That assessment is the blueprint for marine safety in the Arctic Ocean, in this newly accessible ocean. And what that blueprint has brought us already, it brought us the Search and Rescue Agreement. It brought us the Oil Spill Agreement. It brought us the Mandatory Polar Code. It brought us the Bering Straits Traffic Agreement that the United States and Russia together took to the IMO. It brought us the Best Practices Forum, which you'll hear Michael Kingston talk about in a moment, within PAIM, the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I want to say is what we've accomplished in the last, since that 2009 report in 10 years, is laying down a lot of rules for the Arctic. What we haven't accomplished is laying down and bringing forward the kinds of resources that report said we need in the Arctic. And what did that report say we needed? It said it would be good to have ports of refuge. It said it would be good to have icebreaker escort capability. It said it would be good to have salvage vessels if ships lose power or steerage. It would be good to have better ice charting and better ice forecasting. It would be good to have better bathymetric charting. And so, any other place in the world, a lot of this happens commercially. A lot of it happens because there's a revenue system for a seaway, in Canada's case in the St. Lawrence. It also happens because there can be tolls charged, say through a canal. And so, in 2014, I was asked by President Grimson in Iceland at the Arctic Circle and Alice Rogoff, who is my co-chair here and co-chair of the Arctic Circle, to lead an international effort to look at the concept of an international Arctic Seaway and how we might come together to have such a thing. And so what has been discussed here a little bit, Senator Murkowski spoke about it yesterday, is the SEAL Act, S 1177, which has also been introduced in the House as H.R. 3020. It establishes a U.S. Arctic Seaway Development Corporation, very similar to the St. Lawrence Seaway Corporation that is our half of the clamshell with Canada in the St. Lawrence Seaway. It's authorized to collect voluntary, and I want to stress the word voluntary because this is not a suggestion that the U.S. take over the Arctic Ocean by any means. It's that we act as an organizing force to help bring about a seaway in the Arctic Ocean, just as the Russians have with the Northern Sea Route Authority, but to do it in such a way that it's international, cooperative based, and brings resources to the table from many different parties. And as such, we believe it's consistent with the UN Convention on Law of the Sea and customary international law. It aims to, the language of the legislation says it aims to unite Arctic nations in a cooperative shipping union. And it follows previous efforts stemming from the AMSA 2009 report. Now, if I could just say very quickly, we want to see Arctic shipping be boring. And if I could give you an example, today, if you go to Dulles and you want to fly to Shanghai, you'll take off from Dulles, you'll fly over the Canadian Arctic, you'll fly over the Russian Arctic, you'll fly over China, and you'll land in Shanghai. You'll fly over countries that, frankly, didn't really want you flying over them 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But now our air traffic authorities work very closely together to make sure that there's safety. And it's a seamless system. We don't have that yet for Arctic shipping. And other nations of the world say, well, we don't really need this kind of governing assets. What we all know about the Arctic and what we've talked about for the last 2 days is we need resources. And to get resources, you need a way to pay for them. So whether you're going across the Arctic on that blue line, doing some part of the Northwest Passage on the green line, or some sort of the Northeast Passage, the Northern Sea Route on the red line, the point is we as nations can argue till the day is done about who owns what and who controls what, and we will have that argument. But we can also come together and say, we need an international cooperative effort so that it's reliable. Because, well, most Arctic experts, you saw the CMTS study yesterday, others have said the Arctic is basically going to be destinational shipping traffic. If it's going to be more than that, if it's going to be trans-Arctic, it has to be reliable. The shipping companies, the container companies, the people who are working on just-in-time deliveries aren't going to use it, even though it has tremendous geographic and potentially cost advantages. And so the concept, I'm going to skip this slide, and just basically, there's a story I would have told on Senator Sullivan this morning. He was Assistant Secretary of State. I was chair of the Arctic Commission. We were working on the U.S. Arctic policy, which was adopted in 2009. And we said, what do we want out of the Arctic Ocean? And we said it came down to 3 words. And I think, I can't remember who bought the beer that night, but the 3 words that came out were we want an ocean that's safe, secure, and I'm going to underscore the 3rd word, reliable. Because if it's not reliable, commerce won't use it. People won't use it. Dan was, actually 3 of us were interviewed for a front-page New York Times story article on this. That's where Admiral Thad Allen, Commandant of the Coast Guard, said, I'm not going to argue about climate change. Where there was ice, there's now water. And Dan calls me, and after he was quoted as saying safe, secure, reliable, and he said, well, I hope I don't get fired because I just made policy for the United States about a year ahead of the president. But this is our goal, and this is the goal of the United States. Safety means that we have the infrastructure. Security means it's international. What does security really mean? I have very good friends in Russia. I totally admire what the Russians are doing. But a single nation shouldn't have the lion's share of the infrastructure to control shipping in the Arctic. To make it reliable, you want it geopolitically reliable, and you'll hear from Paul Massaro about that. And then reliability itself means you have to be able to interface with commerce. You have to be able to make things work with commerce. And I would stand to say that safety, whether it's safety of human life, safety of property, safety of the environment, that's something we all have in common, no matter how much we might argue about who owns what in the Arctic or who controls what. And so the idea is that we would form in the United States a capability to go out and make deals. And let's talk about some of the deals that might be made. The next slide, there's a title here that says Uber for Icebreakers. You can credit Tero, who's on our panel, as the creator of that line. And the idea of Uber for Icebreakers is this. If the Coast Guard gets a new icebreaker, they're not necessarily getting it for shipping, and frankly, American taxpayers shouldn't pay so China can sell goods to France. But we use icebreakers for a number of different things, and some years some part of the year we may be using them in Antarctica, some part of the year we may be using them to support science, and it may well be that some private and commercial icebreakers in the U.S. as well as publicly owned icebreakers might be dedicated toward this service. Tero ran the Finnish icebreaking service, a private company owned by the government called Arctica. I get that right?
Arctia.
Arctia. And the concept is there's actually enough icebreaking capability in the world that if we cooperate to bring about reliability. Why would we care about doing this? This comes a little bit from a Russian study looking at Suez versus the Northern Sea Route. Suez Canal earns in tariffs about $5.2 billion a year. It takes 17,000 vessels through, about 1 billion tons a year. You've heard all sorts of projections, from very low projections here at this conference to very high projections of what the Northern Sea Route or the Arctic Ocean might be as a carrying capacity. The Russians decided it needs something like $179 billion in public and private investment over the next decade to meet the 80 million ton decree that Mr. Putin had suggested would happen. Whether it's going to happen with destinational shipping or whether it's going to happen with transarctic shipping, the fact is you're not going to get this infrastructure. I know of no legislature on earth that would appropriate this kind of money without some sort of sense of revenue coming through. And the studies that have been done on the high side on the Northern Sea Route suggest that maybe 5 to 10% of Suez traffic could move toward Arctic shipping. That's maybe 1,700 vessels. 1,700 vessels paying what is Russia's current tariff of about $500,000 is about $850 million a year to support, and that'll support the kind of icebreakers that you need to bring about reliability. And so the concept, I'm going to just move quickly now to say that the studies have been done to look at city pairs that might work, where this route could be competitive, what the effectiveness is looking at savings from reduced fuel costs. And so it was mentioned yesterday that there were several reasons why Northern Sea Route traffic went down. You can blame tariffs, you can blame oil prices, you can sanctions, you can blame a number of things, but the fact is that in order to realize the cost savings that are equal to the distance savings, you need reliability. So I'm going to close and we're going to introduce this panel, but basically to say that what we've got going on right now with this bill, Senator Murkowski is very enthusiastic about it. Senator Sullivan, Senator King are the three sponsors. I believe there are other co-sponsors in the wings. The chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee, Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee is on his way to Alaska. They are about to issue a draft Coast Guard authorization bill. That may be one vehicle, there may be other vehicles. The bill may stand on its own. There's been a hearing recently on Arctic shipping in the House. Whether or not we get this done this year, I just want to say this. The result of 5 years of work where the Arctic Circle commissioned these trips around the world is that I think we found that Asian shippers would like to see an international route. And none of that is any back of the hand to Russia as much as it's a geopolitical concern about internationalization. Going past a monopoly helps us get to something that is a little bit more secure. Likewise, in the United States and in Europe and in Canada, we're all wondering how this is going to work and how it's going to affect us. But if this traffic is going to go by our front doors, I think it's very important that we be involved in helping to make sure that it's safe, secure, and reliable. And finally, the question that's come up, and it's been said here many times in this conference, we know that there's a securitization in the Arctic. We also know we want to see a greater presence in the Arctic to avoid an imbalance. And this is one way that that presence can come about in a safe way. And in the end, ladies and gentlemen, what we get is Arctic shipping that could be boring. Thank you very much, and I now want to open up a panel and a discussion. I'm going to start by asking Tero to introduce himself. And Tero, you were the chair of the Arctic Economic Council and head of a large icebreaker fleet and coined this term, Uber for icebreakers. Tell us how something like this might work operationally.
Right, yeah. So if you think of the fact that we have 160, 170 icebreakers in the world, and then you look into the utilization rate of that fleet, it's maybe somewhere 40 or 50%. Bearing in mind the fact that, for instance, on the Baltic Sea, if you combine the Finnish, the Swedish, the Estonian, Latvian Lithuanian, Russian icebreakers, you come up with a figure of more than 30 vessels. And those are used, say, from November or December to March, April, May. And the rest of it is just idle. So what a capacity there is to use in the Arctic areas during summer periods when there is a lot of activity. This capacity is actually used not at all. Out of these more than 30 icebreakers, 4 of them have been in the Arctic. So we're still lacking this international collaboration, and the idea is that we could use this resource on an international basis. And with this, we would be able, first of all, save a lot of money. Instead of buying and acquiring into new icebreakers, we would, in a shared economy thinking, which is a common thinking for Uber or for Airbnb or for many other types of consumer services, we could have the same type of thinking and same type of ideas. Well, what we need of that, of course, we would need some sort of an international collaboration body to do for that, which then brings us to this idea which was introduced by Mead of international collaboration. So the topic was that can the United States facilitate an international Arctic Seaway system? So my answer for that would be yes, it can in equal collaboration with other Arctic nations and stakeholders. But what would be then the governing body, or what would be the sort of the agreemental basis for that? Because of course, United States has sovereign rights to its Arctic territorial waters, like Russia or Canada or Kingdom of Denmark or Norway. So that means that we need international collaboration if we need a pan-Arctic seaway system. So what would it be? Would it be the IMO? Then it would be through governing system, a regulation system. Or could it be some sort of a softer organization, for instance, like the Arctic Council, perhaps? There are already compulsory agreements provided by the Arctic Council, for instance, the search and rescue agreement, to name one. Or could it be something else, like the classification societies or the insurance companies, which might be having a role in this game? But I think that no one country on its own can put up a system which would be implied throughout the Arctic without the collaboration of international stakeholders into this. But definitely, if we would have such a system, we would be able to get into those 3 important goals which were set: being safe, being reliable, and providing secure services. Because for the moment there are situations, for instance, in the icebreaking services, that there is capacity idle somewhere else, and somewhere else there are services required, but no services can be provided. So my question here is that since we have the Ubers, we have the Airbnbs, are we stupid? Or what's happening? Why aren't we able to do this collaboration? So this would be a great potential to move forward, especially now when we see what's happening in the Arctic. So international collaboration is of high importance in this area, and as we heard today and yesterday, there's a need for sort of peaceful work in the Arctic, so this would provide a great example for this particular area as well. And the idea for Uber for icebreakers is sort of expanded into this seaway system thinking, and I think it's a potential, but a lot of collaboration is required.
Tero, thank you. I'm now going to turn to Michael Kingston. Michael is a maritime lawyer who I actually first met at this conference, and a few conferences ago, and he had been working with the insurance industry and helped establish the best practices forum in PAIM that was agreed to at the U.S. Ministerial 2 years ago. Michael, there's hard law and there's soft law. There's freedom of the seas or internal waters. There's port state rules or best practices. How might a seaway come about in the Arctic that is safe, secure, reliable, multinational?
Well, like anything, it needs a collaborative approach, and obviously the draft bill, or the bill that's being introduced, which I've read, is very well thought through, and it shows foresight, and in particular, it's, and you stated this very clearly, it's not a US-centric nationalistic approach. It's a collaborative international approach, and I suppose the underlying issue that is always at the back of insurers' minds, and I worked with Lloyd's of London on their report in 2012, an Arctic opening opportunity and risk in the high north, and it came to similar conclusions to the assessment that you carried out and worked on, showing great leadership in Alaska that led to a lot of the developments and the key findings, as in your report here in the United States, was that there's a lack of infrastructure and there's a lack of support systems, which therefore means that it's not safe, reliable, and secure. And what this would do is create a system that would help with safety and reliability in terms of shipping operations. For obviously salvage is a huge issue for the insurance industry to consider in allowing Arctic operations to proceed under the Polar Code. You have to legally demonstrate that you're catering for extreme scenarios that may occur. And this helps the operator to be able to demonstrate that they have planned their voyage correctly, and it would support that system. And also from a United States point of view, I've noticed the great work of many agencies in the United States, from NASA. They're showing their satellite launch of ISAT-2 out here in this conference, to NOAA, to the United States Coast Guard, you name it, brilliant leadership, but it's all on a theoretical basis where the Arctic is concerned. And I think that this bill would be a United States declaration of responsible intent where the Arctic is concerned.
Thank you. I'm now going to turn to Paul Massaro. Paul is an advisor to the Helsinki Commission and has looked a lot at security issues in Europe. And Paul, what was interesting is that as this bill was drafted by congressional staff, I found ourselves working with a commission that I hadn't heard of much. So tell us first, what is the Helsinki Commission, and what do you see in this?
Yeah, no, absolutely, Mead, and thanks so much for the invitation and having me here. I think our role in this is extremely important. And as you said, I am an advisor, so I do want to make just a minor disclaimer that while what I'm about to say and the views I'm going to express are reflective of the general consensus and sort of reflective of the mandate of the Commission, they may not reflect, the opinions of individual members.
And it could be said that the chair of your commission right now is the chair of the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, which has this bill in it.
That could well be said, yeah.
Yes.
Might be important to note. Well, anyway, I guess, yeah, to begin, what is the Helsinki Commission? Well, the Helsinki Commission is this nifty little body. It's bicameral and bipartisan. It's led by 9 senators and 9 representatives. And all the staff were hired in an agreement between Democrats and Republicans. So, a real rarity these days. But there are 13 of us, and we all advise on sort of a different set of issues. For me, I advise on what in OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is second dimension, or economic and environmental issues, which ranges all the way from sort of anti-money laundering and illicit trade to Arctic issues and Arctic shipping. And the uniting theme of all these is the need for the rule of law. And this sort of thing comes from OSCE, again, that's the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe commitments, an organization that was founded through the Helsinki Final Act in '75. The Helsinki Final Act being sort of the culmination of détente in the Cold War, an agreement between the Soviet Union, the USA, and a number of other states that essentially said, we're going to agree to these principles that fell back in the day into 3 baskets. The first of political military issues, the second of economic and environmental issues, and the third, what we call the human dimension of human rights, rule of law, that sort of thing. And it all took place in Helsinki, so, fantastic. So to this day, we are known as the Helsinki Commission. In '76, Congress founded us under the belief that the Kissinger State Department at the time would not hold the Soviet Union's feet to the fire under the, for the human rights and democracy commitments that they'd recently signed on to. And in fact, we did hold states' feet to the fire. Eventually, state became a close ally, with human rights being part of U.S. foreign policy. And to this day, we continue to try to make sure that U.S. foreign policy, at its core, is about human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. So, these commitments in the OSCE, especially the ones toward the rule of law, are really important for our engagement in this issue, and I think that that's ultimately how we became engaged, especially in this Arctic area. When I took on this portfolio a few years ago, I was told I should meet with Mead Treadwell, and we eventually did meet. We had a great discussion, and afterwards, Mead really sold me on his idea, and we'd produced the original draft of the SEAL Act, Shipping and Environmental Arctic Leadership Act, which then went through a million different revisions and iterations and was eventually introduced into the bill it is today. I think that the approach of the SEAL Act, especially international cooperation pieces, are extremely important. I mean, this is the idea of the United States getting skin in the game, of rule of law nations ensuring that there is skin in the game so as to prevent a number of authoritarian actors, I mean, Russia, of course, is the major one in this area, from determining the rules and standards by which the Arctic will be governed in the future. Obviously, we also think of China now in this space, and I haven't been here for the whole symposium, but I assume that the Polar Silk Road strategy and a number of those other documents have received quite a bit of attention. So this, of course, comes through the Coast Guard dimension and the naval dimension, but it also comes through the rules dimension, and that's what we'd like to see something like this do eventually. And an Arctic Seaway Corporation could bring that U.S. rule of law tradition to the development of this cooperative shipping union in the Arctic. Now we've actually held a few of our own events on this. Not too long ago, we'd had an event called A New Ocean in the North. With maybe some of the people that are in this room. We held that in collaboration with the Congressional Arctic Working Group in the House and the Senate Arctic and Oceans caucuses. And in general, we have continued to remain engaged in the development of this bill and this issue. But I think that, fundamentally for us, this is about ensuring that OSCE principles are respected in the Arctic, in this place where there's more and more activity. It's about sort of raising the eyebrow at a country that is Russia, that is investing quite a bit in this region, and yet has broken all its commitments under the OSCE, under the Helsinki Final Act, all 10 principles of the OSCE Final Act. And trying to bring the values of the OSCE and ensure that they are respected in the region. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Paul. If people would like to ask questions, please go to the microphone. I'm going to start with one for Tero first, which is if you wanted to offer reliable service across the Arctic so that you could go from Fram Strait to Bering Strait, for example, what would be the differences, and how would you configure a set of icebreakers? If I'm not catching you off guard here.
Yeah, not at all. So if you think of the resources available, first of all, as I already described, there are certain times of year that you might have 20, 30 icebreakers available. Of course, the availability is the first one. Then we have the know-how of the crew. That is the second important issue. Some crews are better, some are even better. That has to be secured. In terms of finance, if you look into what's the investment of an icebreaker, if it's built in Finland, it's 150 million euros. If it's built in the States, it's $800 million. Well, there's a small difference in that.
I can get you a nice one for 250.
Yep.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes. But look into, the, say, perhaps monthly rate. What would be the range be? Where maybe somewhere in 2 million, 3 million or something like that to give us the ballpark for that. So that gives us maybe 20, 25, 30 millions per year. And that includes then the crew. So what we need first of all, of course, the vessels. We know that there are. We need the crews, which have to be fit for the job, and we need the financing. And of course, we need the agreemental system, and of course, the freedom of navigation is an issue which has been discussed here as well. So that should be secured in a proper way in this international agreement, which I think would be required with a way or another for this.
So, if you're talking about $30 million a year for an icebreaker, how many icebreakers do you think you would need, or how many $30 million increments do you think you would need to offer reliability to, say, container shippers who are interested in taking advantage of this shortcut?
Yeah, well, if you have a look into the potential increase in the traffic, which we have discussed here today and yesterday, and what is the expectation for the, say, next 15 to 20 years, we're heavily lacking capacity. So I would say that a fleet of, say, 15 to 25 icebreakers would be required, and that fleet more or less already is there if we use it wisely. But if we continue using the fleet this way, that, this is my sort of national capacity, or this is used only for this and that purpose with certain restrictions, then we need just new vessels.
Thank you. Paul, in your discussion, I'm going to turn back to Michael in a second, but in your discussions, there are places where we're working well with Russia and China. I think it was said here yesterday by the Secretary of Energy that we're hoping to get past trade relationships and see a much stronger energy trade relationship, for example. With Russia, we have worked to establish strong cooperation in marine safety. And the comity, COMITY, of the Arctic Council has been generally positive. The Russians have helped us get all of these major gains in the Arctic Council that we've talked about for marine safety. Do you see an imbalance? I mean, because I believe that what has been attractive to several of the senators that I've talked to, the congressmen I've talked to, is just trying to internationalize the approach to bring about stability. How has that worked with other energy projects, other transportation systems?
Well, I can't really speak to other energy projects and transportation systems, but I can say that, all 8 Arctic Council members are members of the OSCE, right? I mean, and this body, we've actually seen some successes, especially over the last, it's been a long time, it's been decades, I mean, the major successes to follow the Soviet Union in some way in the internationalization multilateral approach, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when we're able to, let's say, have 7 of the 8 Arctic nations working in cooperation, investing in the Arctic, then Russia tends to eventually turn around and embrace the rules that are being followed by everybody else, but you got to hold out for the long term. You got to stick to your principles, and we got to be there to begin with. Which, in this particular time, I mean, the United States, isn't quite there in the way it needs to be.
Thank you. Michael just pointed to the fact that we've got 2 questioners. Let me start on my left.
I think this.
Actually, were you first? Go ahead, Rob.
Oh, you starting on your left? That's interesting. Mead, my question is to you. I mean, this is an interesting idea, but you're calling for the rule of law. It's focused, it's an American focus on shipping. And given the fact that one of the major destinational shipping for the Americans from Alaska is, of course, the TAPS line, the oil trade that goes from Valdez south, does this require then some redrafting or even perhaps the abolition of the Jones Act? Or how does that play into, if you're going for a rule of law and you're going for an internationalization of Arctic shipping, what will the United States be doing vis-a-vis Jones Act?
Actually, I don't think any changes to the Jones Act are considered in this. And further oil that goes from Valdez usually goes between 2 U.S. states, and when oil is exported from Valdez to Asian countries, it can go in Coast Guard approved, home port approved Asian tankers or international tankers. So I don't really see that as an issue at all with this. I think what we're saying is this, is that if today's container ships are 15 to 18,000 TEUs, they're not cheap, okay? And to get an Arctic strengthened container ship built, we've seen several studies over the years, that's a major commitment. You've seen it looked at by Chinese firms like COSCO, Japanese firms, Korean firms, European firms like Maersk, and pretty much every analysis, I'm going to say that, Lawson Brigham, my good friend, is going to win his bet. He gets a steak dinner next year if there's not regular trans-Arctic shipping, and I'll be delighted to buy it for him. But the point is this, is that if you do have a seaway system that does stress reliability and does stress having the resources for reliability, where nations agree we're going to bring the resources together in the same way that we've divvied up the North Atlantic for air traffic control, then investors can rely on this. But without it, you're unlikely to see it.
Yes, thank you. Fascinating topic. To what extent does your model incorporate risk mitigation in terms of how user fees may be put aside for a fund to offset any potential disasters that might occur? And associated with that, what is the role that P&I clubs may play in the reliability and the operation of a more almost a line type predicted service?
So a quick answer to the first part, the legislation does not contain kind of a large Arctic oil spill fund of one kind or another. And there have been several proposals made on that at the Arctic Council level. I'll also say there are proposals there at IMO to remove heavy fuel oil, to try to move toward LNG bunkering and so forth, where a system like this may actually help foster investment in things like LNG bunkering and spill response equipment. But I'm going to ask Michael to respond to the P&I Club's question.
Sure. Just on the first point as well, I think it's important to point out in reading this legislation that this isn't a prescriptive legislation that says, right, this is exactly how this is going to work. It actually is a two-stage approach where it unlocks a framework and basically puts a legislative framework in place that then appoints a board of directors to put in place the nuts and bolts of how it's actually going to work and sit down and that includes the issues that you mentioned, and actually the legislation specifically says that the board of directors shall develop a set of policy recommendations regarding the facilities and infrastructures necessary to provide services related to safety and environmental protection and response for vessels transiting the Arctic sea routes, and so on and so forth. So it specifically is geared to take those issues into account to mitigate risk and avoid disaster. And from a P&I club perspective, well, ship owners are obviously, and the open insurance market, so the whole insurance market, the P&I club deals with liability, but they're very encouraging of this proposal, because anything that will help reduce risk is obviously hugely important to the insurance industry in their consideration of risk. As things stand at the moment, Arctic shipping is excluded under the Institute hull clauses of Lloyd's. Any above 70 degrees north, you have to specifically negotiate an exception with the insurer. And under P&I club rules, so for the liability of the vessel, for the wreck removal and the consequential environmental loss, so the Costa Concordia, its hull was paid for insurance in the hull market, 525 million, and then the 1.5 billion of liability for its removal was the P&I club insurance. If you go outside normal trading patterns, you have to get the special permission of the P&I club, and of course ships going through the Arctic for the most part, are outside normal trading patterns. So in those negotiations for those exceptions, the insurer is going to be asking the operator, are you considering using this system? And in fact, you must use this system, and it's a warranty of your insurance policy, and if you don't, you're not insured.
So in shorthand, you're saying that a law doesn't have to compel somebody to use this seaway, but an insurer might?
Well, if I was an insurer sitting in Lloyd's of London, and indeed I advise the London insurance market on Arctic matters and their guidelines for insurance, and we reference now the Arctic Shipping Best Practices Information Forum, which was established by the Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment Working Group, which basically is the go-to portal, a live web portal at arcticshipping.is for what is the best information about the implementation of the regulation and best practice. Well, we're referencing that in the guidelines, and we would also reference this system in the guidelines, and this system would no doubt appear somewhere under voyage planning, under the Arctic Shipping Best Practice Information Forum web portal, under Chapter 11 of the Polar Code for voyage planning. It would not be sensible to fill out your plan without using a system that's going to mitigate your risk.
Thank you. I'm getting the hook look from my friend Mike here. I do want to say that Tero Vauraste, who's been with us today, is a new fellow at the Polar Institute here at the Wilson Center. And Tero, we're delighted to have you.
Thank you.
Where's your white cat, Tero?
Here.
Yeah.
Don't you see?
We had James Bond with us yesterday. We've got the villain today. He just
Excellent.
doesn't have his white cat.
I also just
You know you're into day 2 when comments like this.
And that's the Irish way of doing a day too, you know. It might get a bit tricky.
And I want to acknowledge the support of and the engagement that we've had with parliamentarians around the world, in Europe and in Asia, as well as here in North America, to look at this. Basically, what this does, if you read the legislation, it says, let's create a board of directors, go out and get a business plan, and see if a business plan can come back that makes sense, that can pay for use the spare icebreaker capacity in the world, come up with a stream of revenue that gives us the reliability within a decade that we're looking for. And it's based on concepts like the St. Lawrence Seaway, based on the concept like ComSat that gave us communication satellites, where a U.S. organized company organized global telecommunications in the dawn of the space age. And I think where we are is this, Mr. Chair, and I'll just pass it back to you, Mike. Thank you for having the Polar Institute continue to look at issues like this, and I appreciate the support that we've gotten from the Congress to consider it. And as this is shaped, I think there's a lot of opportunity to answer many of the infrastructure gap questions that we've discussed at this conference for 2 days. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mead. Thanks to the panel. Great presentation. Thank you very much.
Folks,
So,
next question.
yeah, next panel. Yeah, thank you so much.